mining companies up in Minnesota did not rule out violating environmental laws. They polluted Lake Superior until Miles Lord, the judge in Minnesota, stopped them. And if he wouldn't have stopped them from dumping them tailings into Lake Superior, they'd still be doing it.
Well, you're absolutely right. And so we did nothing in our bill to prevent mining from occurring. We recognize that Wisconsin has mineral resources. We concluded that there can be responsible mining, and we believe that a majority of people in Wisconsin would support responsible mining, but they would insist on a responsible mining law. And no responsible mining law gives the edge to the company. The edge should be to the Department of Natural Resources, who protects the public interest. You want to be fair to the company, but you don't want to be taking shortcuts, and you don't want to be depriving the department of making the best decisions that are there for the natural resources, because that's their job. And the company may have some real unique challenges, but you don't want to take shortcuts like they did at reserve mining, which resulted in 65,000 tons per day, every day for 40 years being pumped into Lake Superior, which left the water supply in Duluth and shoreline communities polluted with asbestos. Yeah, Frank.
Senator Jauch, just a little perspective here. I haven't been a resident of Wisconsin for that long, so. You mentioned that we shouldn't be writing law, we shouldn't be appealing to the corporation's desires, the governor shouldn't be bound to corporate interests. You also mentioned the issue with the Crandon mine, how that permitting process lasted 78 years, and that was
almost 9. Yeah,
almost 9. I take it reference from that your observation is that was too long. That there was something. So in the interim, but it seems as though, from my perspective anyway, that really this mining issue didn't come up until this mining company raised interest. So what happened in the interim between Crandon Mine and the interests of this mining company, and why, or was there any responsible mining legislation being pursued? And so did it take a mining company to actually raise the issue?
Yeah, they did.
And why do we have to wait for a mining company to raise that issue?
First of all, Ladysmith was in fact permitted after Crandon. I mean, Ladysmith worked, so the law works. Crandon.
So Ladysmith did work?
Ladysmith worked.
It worked good.
Under the current law.
It worked good.
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Under
great.
current,
But it's not perfectly reclaimed.
It worked good.
Under current law, it worked fine.
Yeah.
Now what happened in Crandon had nothing to do with the regulatory agency dragging their feet. You had two companies, including Exxon, that were proposing a mine in an area that drained. It was an acid. It was a sulfide mine in which there would be significant amount of drainage into the Wolf River, which flows into a very popular part of Wisconsin. And so you ended up with some really deep concerns about what was going to happen to the natural resources in the area. Even Tim Sullivan, chair of the Mining Association, will admit that he did not think that that was a good location or a good project. So that the Crandon should not be used as an example of the regulatory system failing, but it was really an example of a sulfide mine in an area that probably shouldn't be considered.
Okay, I thought you made a reference to that process taking too long.
Let me clarify something too that's important. Minnesota does more iron ore mining than any state in the nation. And Minnesota takes, the last expansion for Minnesota took 2 years. So no one has been able to produce any evidence why some company can do it in 300 or 360 days.
And that was already a mine. It was just
that's an existing mine. The second thing is that there's a sulfide mine in Minnesota that's been under the permit process for just about 5 years. So if you're going to look to Minnesota as the mining state, they have a mine project over there where the regulatory system's taking the right amount of time because there's some serious environmental issues. When the company put their ad in the paper, I didn't dispute it. and immediately went to work in putting together a proposal that would reduce the amount of time taken to do a permit. Under Senator Schultz and my proposal, the initial phase would be reduced by 1.5 years. The second part is streamlined and defined so that you know what you're dealing with, so it doesn't go on forever. For contested case, we allowed people to be able to use the contested case because we think it's a basic right. This is not we the corporations, it is we the people. And there needs to be a proper balance between the two. And we included that, but we included the contested case with a deadline. It had to be done by 270 days. It couldn't go on for 350 days or longer. So we shortened the timelines on the other end. And the final point that we made in our proposal is that we protected the taxpayers. Under Wisconsin law, the company will pay very few taxes to the local communities because they're able to use what is called a net proceeds tax. In other words, they're able to reduce their liability by deducting all of their expenses and their depreciation, which gets down to ending up with paying for the first few years very little money to these communities who have to invest it. In Minnesota, they have a gross tonnage tax. So in Minnesota, for 8 million tons of ore, a Minnesota iron ore company would pay $18 million in taxes. In Wisconsin, for the first few years, they might be paying $1 million. Now, we weren't trying to get them to pay $18 million. We said for 5 years they ought to pay $5 million and draw that against any future cost so that there would be no net increase to the company. We thought it was as important for us to protect the taxpayers as it was to protect the company. And the Assembly proposal even included a $1 million a year, which I think is token. And we would have been able to find a compromise had we had the opportunity.
The fact that the company has now said they are going to pull up and not interested any longer, is this going to continue on? Are we going to pick up where we left off, or is this just scrap? Start all over next time?
I've told the governor, I've told Tim Sullivan, I've said publicly that we should finish the job. We do not want to leave this bitter debate that has divided people throughout Wisconsin to a point where there's just a bitter feeling, bitter taste in people's mouths. The legislature's adjourned, but that should not be an excuse to quit working on the issue. Whether Gogebic is the company is not relevant. We promised to reform our mining laws to make them workable, real, and responsive. That's what I think we need to continue to do, and we're going to try to come up with a process to do that.
Did I understand, or did I hear that the mining company asked for a law that would be patterned somewhat after Minnesota's?
Well, they said they were, but the law didn't look a lot like Minnesota.
But that's what they wanted.
Well, what happened is that in April of last year, shortly after they wrote their ad in the paper, the mining company wrote their own law. So they drafted, their attorney drafted a bill that was for and by the mining company. On about May 15th or so, no one had seen it, no legislators had seen it. I had been briefed on it twice by their attorney. There were a lot of bad things in this draft. And I mean, it was unconstitutional, it was a violation of the Water Compact, they only talked about 300 days, it was unrealistic. They really tied the hands of the natural resources. It was objectively the worst environmental piece of legislation in state's history. Senator Hopper, who was the chair of the Senate Labor Committee, or Jobs Committee, decided to hold a public hearing on a Wednesday, scheduled a public hearing on this draft that no one in the public had seen for the following Monday, because his goal was to push this thing through in the following week. I put out a press release and said it's pretty outrageous that the public hasn't had a chance. The governor's office came over and discouraged any further consideration. That draft did not get a public hearing. They pulled back. Not a Republican touched that bill for 5 months. It was only after the Senate committee was established in September that the Assembly Republicans, 5 of them, met secretly with the company and wrote their Assembly Bill 426. And that's thus the story of how we're trying to take the items where we agree with between the two bills. There are 7 items we absolutely agree on, including Senator Schultz and I agree that these rock piles should not be considered landfills. They're not solid waste dumps. They shouldn't be subject to